14th of February 1943, before dawn. Sidi Bou Zid. Cold air rolling down from the hills toward the approaches to Kasserine. The sand smelling faintly of oil and cordite from last night's probes. A German Panzer commander lifts his binoculars and freezes. Through the wavering heat of a rising engine plume, a new silhouette pushes over a low ridge. High turret, rounded cast nose, broad tracks chopping at the stony ground. The clatter deepens to a continuous growl, and the muzzle that steadies on the crest is not the short, stubby type they expect from British forms. It is a 75mm, long enough to promise trouble. Nicht der Panzer IV, he thinks, as a loader curses and the radio fills with clipped calls from forward infantry, unknown Amerikaner Panzer in strength. The first exchange is abrupt. A German armor-piercing round cracks out and slaps sparks from the stranger's glasses, the angle wrong, the plate sloped. The reply comes faster than they've trained for, a flat report from an M4's 75mm M3 gun, and shards spit across a rock where a machine gun team had huddled. More shapes gather behind it, tall-profile Shermans and lower, awkward M3 Lees whose sponson guns rake the plain, elements of the U.S. 1st Armored Division arriving in Tunisia in numbers the Afrika Korps had not yet measured. The Germans know the Panzer IV Eyewitnesses with its long KWK-40 can kill at range, but the shock is in the rhythm, quick target shifts, steady movement, radios humming on every tank, and the unnerving sense that American industry can send more of these tomorrow. A corporal later wrote that the ground seemed to tremble with their approach, as if the pass itself had become a factory line. In that pre-dawn confusion, the Axis discovery is not a single tank, but a system, guns, crews, fuel, and replacement hulls, rolling west to east. This first jolt at the edge of Kasserine sets the question we must answer next. Why tanks decided battles in North Africa, and what each side believed armored warfare could deliver. Dawn of mechanized war arrived not in North Africa, but in the sweeping plains of Eastern Europe and the hedgerows of France. In September 1939, when German armor punched into Poland, the world saw tanks used not as slow-moving infantry escorts, but as the sharp point of a doctrine designed by thinkers like Heinz Guderian. Fast columns, coordinated radios, and a belief that speed and shock could shatter armies before they could react. By May 1940, this theory became terrifying reality. In the Battle of France, Panzer divisions surged through the Ardennes, bypassing strong points and collapsing French command within weeks. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, working alongside Stuka dive bombers and motorized infantry, proved that the tank was no longer a supporting actor. It was the spearhead of blitzkrieg, a concept that promised lightning victories and seemed to confirm German confidence in engineering skill and tactical audacity. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with uneasy fascination. Emerging from the Great Depression and clinging to pre-war doctrines, America fielded only a small armored force, with tanks scattered between infantry and cavalry responsibilities. Many leaders still believed the main killers of tanks would be other tanks, so specialized anti-tank guns and mobile tank destroyers were emphasized instead of heavily armed battle tanks. In 1940, the U.S. Army's primary armored vehicles, like the M2 medium tank, were lightly armored and undergunned compared to their German counterparts. Yet American strategists were beginning to absorb critical lessons. Reliability, ease of repair, and vast production capacity could become decisive advantages if war demanded scale. By 1941, as Europe burned, the United States accelerated its rearmament. Factories that once built cars now hammered out welded hulls and cast turrets, experimenting with designs that could be manufactured quickly and maintained in harsh conditions. The theory forming in Washington and at Aberdeen Proving Ground held that a medium tank, fast enough to exploit breakthroughs, tough enough to withstand common anti-tank fire, and cheap enough to build by the thousands, would be the backbone of American armored forces. It was a different bet than Germany's aspiration for increasingly powerful, highly engineered machines. The U.S. believed that logistics and numbers, fed by its industrial might, could grind down even a technically superior enemy. Both visions were about to collide. By late 1942, American armor was on ships bound for North Africa, and German panzer commanders would soon meet opponents forged not only in steel, but in the measured confidence of a nation whose production lines could replace every lost tank and then double the fleet. The clash to come would reveal whose faith in armor, precision, or scale would prove the more lethal on the field, the opposing machines that would define the armored battles of 1943 and 1944 could not have been more different in philosophy. Germany's Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger I, first entering service in August 1942, embodied the conviction that superiority lay in overwhelming firepower and heavy protection. Its 8.8 cm KWK-36 L-56 gun, adapted from the feared flak anti-aircraft weapons, could punch through 100 mm of armor at combat ranges that most Allied crews barely believed possible. Its thick frontal hull armor, up to 100 mm plate, mostly vertical, made it a fortress of steel weighing between 54 and 57 tons. Yet such power demanded a price. Each Tiger was a complex, labor-intensive creation, consuming precious materials, requiring skilled mechanics, and produced in only about 1,147 units between 1942 and August 1944. It was a rare beast on the battlefield, and its very presence could tilt the psychological balance before a shot was fired. Facing it, the Americans fielded the M4 Sherman, lighter, faster, and built with an entirely different war in mind. Rolling off assembly lines from February 1942 to July 1945, the Sherman weighed roughly 33 to 38 tons, carried a 75mm M3 gun, and could reach speeds near 25 to 30 mph on roads. Armor thickness varied, but its glacis plate was strategically sloped, improving deflection despite thinner steel. What truly distinguished the Sherman, however, was not its individual performance, but its staggering production, 49,134 units, standardized, interchangeable, and supported by spare parts delivered through a logistical network unmatched in the war. Where a Tiger crew might hold its ground knowing they were the apex predator, the Sherman's crews fought with the knowledge that reinforcements and replacements were always coming, steel in numbers as a weapon in itself. Technically, the matchup was lopsided in a duel. The Tiger's gun could destroy a Sherman at long range before the American weapon could penetrate its frontal armor at similar distances. The Sherman often relied on flanking shots, superior rate of movement, coordinated artillery, and sheer quantity to level the odds. German crews prized accuracy and striking power, but frequent breakdowns, fuel shortages, and the difficulty of recovering disabled Tigers meant their tactical influence could evaporate with a single mechanical failure. Meanwhile, American maintenance crews could revive a damaged Sherman quickly, swap components with ease, and return it to the line by nightfall. Combat effectiveness depended not just on penetration tables and armor diagrams, but on who could keep their tanks running, supplied, and present at the decisive point. Thus, the battlefield was set as an arena of contrasts. German engineering brilliance and ambition against American pragmatism and logistical mastery. The first major encounters in North Africa would soon reveal how these choices played out when theory met fire. In November 1942, as Operation Torch brought American forces into North Africa, the first real clash between U.S. armor and the seasoned veterans of the Afrika Korps unfolded in the broken ridges leading toward the Kasserine Pass. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, young crews, newly shipped machines, and doctrine still tested only in training grounds, joined British and Free French units in an environment dominated for 2 years by German initiative. Panzer commanders expected opponents like the lightly armored M3 Stuart or the outdated French tanks pressed into Allied service. Instead, they began to glimpse Shermans rolling off landing ships at Algiers and Oran, quickly pushed inland despite limited familiarity with desert warfare. These medium tanks, with their stabilized 75mm guns and dependable engines, arrived not as isolated curiosities but as battalion formations built to fight as a system. When U.S. battalions such as the 15th Tank Battalion entered the fighting around Sidi Bou Zid and later at Kasserine itself, the Germans noticed a new tempo. American armor did not linger after an engagement. Damaged vehicles were pulled back, repaired, and returned to the line within hours. Fuel and ammunition appeared behind them with surprising regularity, and air cover, from P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks, harassed German movements that once operated with impunity. A German report from Panzer Regiment 8 complained that the enemy's tanks came from the rear as though massed and unending, a sign not only of industrial strength but of a doctrine aimed at sustaining pressure rather than seeking the perfect tactical strike. Yet the Americans paid heavily for their inexperience. Ambushes by Panzer III and Ivor units and the deadly 88mm guns of anti-tank formations tore through Shermans when they advanced without reconnaissance. The battle showed both sides their strengths. German tactical sharpness and superior armor-piercing power could still dominate a head-on engagement, but the appearance of American medium tanks in growing numbers threatened to erode that edge with every new shipment to the front. In the smoke of Tunisia, the Axis first understood that this was not a temporary opponent. It was the beginning of a contest that would only intensify as U.S. industry surged into war. By the opening months of 1943, German field intelligence no longer dismissed American armor as a supplementary force riding on British coattails. Reports from North Africa and the Eastern Front began to catalog an unsettling trend. More U.S. medium tanks in every new engagement, returning to the line faster than losses could be inflicted. Officers in Tunisia wrote that Shermans seemed to reappear as swiftly as they were destroyed, a rhythm that hinted at a supply chain unlike anything the Axis could match. Crews described battles where a platoon of Shermans knocked out in the morning was again sighted advancing by late afternoon, engines newly roaring and markings still streaked with the dust of field repairs. What unnerved them most was not just the number of hulls, but the tempo of their resurrection. At the same time, Allied intelligence officers tackled the so-called German tank problem, analyzing serial numbers from captured Panzer wrecks to estimate the rate of German production. Their conclusion that Germany was building tanks at roughly 205 per month during the crucial period from mid-1940 to late 1942 revealed a ceiling that American factories were already poised to surpass. The German High Command received its own sobering assessments. U.S. output was accelerating, and every month that passed would widen the gap between what Germany could field and what the United States could ship, repair, and replace. Letters home from Panzer crews carried the anxiety that statistics could not conceal. One corporal wrote of facing a sea of olive green boxes trailing dust across the horizon, each one a reminder that technical excellence alone could not hold the line. Experienced tankers, once confident that the enemy's armor appeared in manageable batches, now spoke of battles dragging on not until the Americans were defeated, but until the Germans ran out of shells, fuel, or luck. Even the formidable Tigers could not be everywhere, and the stress of knowing they were outnumbered, sometimes 5-1, began to gnaw at morale. A shift was underway. The realization that future victories would not depend solely on the best gun or thickest plate, but on the side that could keep sending tanks to the front without pause. That insight would lead inevitably to the next question. How did the United States turn its industrial engine into such overwhelming force? By 1942-43, the war had shifted into a juggernaut of industry, and the scale at which the United States could convert its economy into armor production was staggering. American planners had set audacious targets, including on the order of 120,000 tanks and 55,000 aircraft in the early 1940s build-up phase factories originally meant for cars. Refrigerators or farm implements were retooled overnight. Assembly lines built medium tanks like the M4 Sherman by the thousands. Spare part manufacturing became systematic. And the logistical backbone, from U.S. harbors to railheads in England, France and Germany, was constructed at breakneck speed. The result, over 50,000 Shermans by the war's end. In sharp contrast, Germany faced an entirely different production and logistics reality. While German tank engineering remained world-class in many respects, Industrial-scale production was hampered by raw material shortages, Allied bombing disruptions, and the sheer complexity of specialist vehicles. For example, the Panther tank, Panzer IV, managed a total production of roughly 6,000 units during 1943-45. Even that number masks serious issues. Spares became harder to produce, recovery vehicles were scarce, and immobilized tanks piled up at the front. A U.S. government study noted that Germany was unable to produce more new tanks and a satisfactory amount of spare parts at the same time. What this meant in practical terms was that American armored units were resilient. A Sherman knocked out in France could be recovered, repaired, and back in action, while the Germans struggled to even tow a disabled Tiger or Panther off the battlefield. Standardized assemblies meant components could be swapped quickly. The U.S. maintenance doctrine emphasized repair and return rather than merely salvage. Lend-lease shipments added Allied tanks and trucks to the supply flow, amplifying the reach of U.S. armor. German crews, by contrast, often faced the frustration of waiting days or never for a replacement engine or track links. Recovery vehicles were few, and fuel shortages became routine. The net strategic impact, even though many German tanks remained technically superior on paper, on the ground, the war was turning into a numbers game, where production speed, repair throughput, and logistics depth mattered more than individual tank quality. The stage is now set to see how this industrial edge translated into battlefield dominance in subsequent campaigns. In June 1944, as the Allied armies poured ashore in Normandy, the fight among armored forces took a decisive turn. Across the bocage country of northern France, medium tanks of the U.S. armored divisions faced the likes of the German Panzerkampfwagen Panther, the heavy Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Furs, and even the Tiger II, machines designed for dominance. The Panther, first production in 1943, about 6,000 built in total, combined sloped frontal armor with the 75mm KWK-42 L-70 gun, and by July 30, 1944, there were reported to be some 432 Panthers in France. German documentation holds that approximately 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers, a figure that signaled how heavily German commanders relied on their most advanced medium tank. From the Allied perspective, the standard U.S. medium tank, though outgunned at range by the Panther's gun and at frontal armor by its sloped plate, was neither rare nor tactically isolated. American tank battalions, integrated with infantry and artillery and backed by air power, pushed forward relentlessly. During the breakout at St. Lo, elements of General George Patton's U.S. Third Army exploited the momentum built by the air bombardment and infantry softening, and then poured tanks through the breach. Even when Panthers and Tigers forced knockouts, the Americans simply replaced lost Shermans, rotated crews, and pressed on. Meanwhile, German heavy tank units, such as the Schwer Panzer Regiment 503, found that their strategic value was increasingly pinched by logistics. Spare parts slow to arrive. Recovery crews overstretched, fuel and ammunition in short supply. German tank crews recorded frustration again and again. We fight, we kill, but they come back worse than we leave them. Against a tank like the Panther that might shrug off a Sherman's 75mm round from the front, the Americans innovated flanking tactics, hull-down positions, artillery and airstrikes to force German tanks into vulnerable angles. The battle didn't always come down to one-on-one duels. It became about who could orchestrate multiple units, integrate air and ground assets, keep the flow of replacements going, and exploit terrain. Even extraordinary German tanks with superior armament and protection could not maintain battlefield dominance if they were few in number, isolated, or awaiting repairs. By the close of August, the results were clear. The qualitative edge of German armor had been eroded not necessarily by a single Sherman in heroic action, but by the sustained presence of many Shermans, supported by supply, coordinated tactics, and command flexibility. The stage is now set to explore the psychological impact of this shift, to examine how morale, expectation, and fear became as potent as steel and gun bars. In the sodden fields outside Caen, the veteran tanker of a heavy German regiment sat waiting for his recovery crew beneath a gray sky that spilled rain in cold drizzles. For years he had believed in the invincibility of his machine, with thick armor, a long-range gun, and crews who trained together. Now he counted the tracks of enemy tanks scratching into the mist like the sound of a gathering swarm. As he later wrote in a memoir, "Every time we knocked one of them out, we could hear another starting up in the mist behind us. And we had to hope our engine held another hour." The war of attrition had silently become a war of endurance, not only of steel, but of spirit. German Panzer crews who once prowled the battlefield with confidence now faced immobilized tigers and Panthers stuck in the mud, lying silent while recovery parties struggled to arrive. Spare tracks delayed, fuel convoys missed their windows. The psychological strain grew, sitting idle while enemy medium tanks, once thought inferior, rumbled past at dawn, reinforced by air attack and artillery fire. One senior commander admitted quietly that he feared not being outgunned, but being out-replaced. In contrast, American armor crews climbed into their familiar Shermans with new confidence. They had seen how spare parts and maintenance teams waited behind the lines, how a knocked-out tank this morning might be back in action by afternoon, and how fresh units of Shermans rolled forward without stop. One American tanker recalled how he felt a surge of rhythm when the engines of his squadron thundered up the road behind him. Not just relief, but a sense of momentum. The enemy could win an engagement, but the Americans could keep arriving. For the Germans, that revelation was horrifying. Their doctrine of striking the decisive blow seemed dissolved into a grinding fight for replacement. Crews slowed their advances, held their tanks back from exposed ground, and evacuated earlier when they might once have pressed on. What the Allies did not fire but unceasingly mobilized, logistics, repair, renewal, became a weapon. The psychological dimension of armored warfare now favored those who believed their factory, their rails, and their maintenance crews were as lethal as their 75mm guns. As this mental shift altered behavior on the battlefield, the next section will explore how these changes produced new tactical strategic consequences in armored operations. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the tactical and strategic consequences of armored warfare began to crystallize in full view. On the tactical level, the U.S. doctrine, built around medium tanks in mass, coordinated with infantry, artillery, and air support, underpinned by unrivaled logistics, forced the German commanders to rethink their armor employment. Heavy units built around the Panzerkampfwagen 66 Tiger Affe, the Panzerkampfwagen 6000 Tiger II, and the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther could no longer be used as the agile spearhead formations they were designed to be. Instead, these formidable tanks increasingly found themselves held back as mobile reserves or fire brigades, waiting for a breakthrough or an Allied armored push rather than leading it. The clash at Normandy, followed by the rapid American advance across France in August 1944, illustrated the point. Quantity plus momentum often trumped individual vehicle quality. The Allies did not necessarily need to outgun the Panther one-on-one. They needed to strike repeatedly, exploit flanks, rotate out losses, and keep the pace so the Germans could not concentrate their best tanks at the decisive point. Strategically, this shift was even more profound. German war production remained fixed on specialist heavy tanks, each costlier, slower to build, and more demanding of resources, while the United States poured out thousands of Shermans and improved derivatives. Backed by production lines, spares, recovery networks, and transport, German industrial planners recognized the problem. Win local battles with your heavies, but you cannot win the war of armored numbers unless you match output and repair rate. As one German panzer general later admitted, the heavies won individual battles, but the mediums won the war. German command doctrines, which once hinged on decisive armored thrusts, had to adapt, sometimes grudgingly, to defensive attrition battles, mobile defense and delaying tactics. Meanwhile, U.S. armored divisions became the vanguard of Allied offensives, a rolling mass of medium tanks hitting at multiple points, sustained by a logistical tail nobody on the German side could replicate. What emerges is a new calculus of warfare. Technical excellence is vital, but in a theater where the industrial engine, repair network, and sheer volume of presence matter increasingly, the side that can maintain momentum, rotate losses, and present fresh armor in force will shape the outcome. The German armored force may have held qualitative superiority, but its strategic condition meant it could not match the American armored resolution at scale. With that foundation laid, we now turn to how both sides adapted their tactics and machines in response to these changing realities. As the war progressed, both sides found their armored forces stretching into new limits, and both responded with adaptations born of necessity. On the American side, the standard M4 Sherman, while reliable and plentiful, was no longer guaranteed to prevail in frontal engagements against advanced German armor. Its comparatively thin armor and the 75mm gun struggled particularly when faced with the frontal plates of the Panther or the heavier Tigers. The U.S. Ordnance Department responded by introducing improved variants. For example, the Sherman armed with the 76mm M1 gun, which entered production in January 1944. At the same time, factory production included Shermans fitted with a 105mm howitzer for assault and infantry support roles. Suspension systems were also improved with the wider horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, giving better ride stability and track durability. On the German side, the plateau of tank quality began to merge with real-world limitations. The Panther series, including the Ausf G variant, was technically formidable, but suffered mechanical unreliability. Final drive breakdowns, engine overheating, and fuel system fires plagued early models. Recovery and maintenance burdens grew as heavy tanks demanded more parts, more manpower, and more logistics. By late 1944, many heavy tank battalions were operating at less than 30% of authorized strength, while specific day-by-day unit strength numbers vary by front. Historians confirm that German heavy armor units in the Ardennes offensive faced fuel and spares crises. German crews complained that when their machines broke down, they often had to wait days for parts or flat out lacked the recovery vehicles to tow them. Meanwhile, the American logistic tail carried damaged Shermans out of the line and returned them reinforced, repaired, and ready for action many times faster. What emerges is that neither side had perfect machines. The Sherman remained vulnerable in duels and had limitations in armor and gun power. The Panther and its kin were mechanically brittle, costly, slow to build, and increasingly dependent on a supply chain already under sustained air attack. But the adaptation processes mattered. The U.S. system emphasized a cycle of build, repair, return, reinforced by standardization and mass output. The Germans increasingly found themselves adapting by simplifying production variants, attempting to streamline Panther subvariants, add more assault gun types, and reduce complexity. But the momentum had already shifted. The German heavy tank program simply couldn't scale to offset the American armored stream. Having examined these limitations and adaptations, we now move into the post-war legacy, how the machines, doctrines, and lessons from this armored contest shaped the Cold War and beyond. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the steel carcasses of tanks across Europe and North Africa marked not an ending, but a transformation in military thought. The Sherman, produced in astonishing numbers and adapted into countless roles, armored recovery vehicles, flamethrower tanks, self-propelled guns, and more, left behind a clear lesson. Mobility, logistics, and ease of support are not secondary to armor and firepower, but equal pillars of armored success. It showed that a tank is not only a weapon, but part of a system, factory lines, rail transport, repair crews, fuel convoys, and standardized parts, an insight that shaped U.S. and Western doctrines for decades. Commanders and engineers looked back on how these tanks could be repaired, rotated, and reused, and they recognized that industrial strength could determine the outcome of battles before they were even fought. For Germany, the post-war reckoning was sharper. The Tiger and Panther had proven that powerful guns and thick armor could dominate in individual duels. yet also demonstrated the limits of machines too complex and too few in number to sustain a prolonged campaign. Designers and tacticians emerged from the war with a refined understanding. It is not enough for an armored vehicle to be technologically superior. It must be producible under stress, maintainable in field conditions, and supported by robust logistics. What had begun as a confident belief in heavy armor became, through bitter experience, a recognition that the battlefield extends far beyond the gun barrel. Veterans on each side carried different memories. German tankers remembered frustration, empty fuel tanks, immobile giants waiting for spares, victories that slipped away as enemy formations replenished. American crews remembered the confidence that came from knowing reinforcements would arrive, that repairs would be made, and that the push forward would not pause. The legacy of Sherman versus Tiger is therefore not simply a comparison of steel, but a reminder that the war was won as much by the factory worker and the mechanic as by the crewman in the turret. As we turn to the final reflections, this understanding leads us back to the human cost and courage within those steel hulls. Dawn returns to Kasserine. Cold light crawls over the jagged ridge and reveals a landscape littered with steel, burnt-out Panzer hulls, a Sherman lying broken where the fight raged hardest, tracks half buried in dust. A weary German tanker stands in the hatch of his immobilized machine, goggles around his neck, staring across the plain. There, behind the wrecked Sherman, sunlight glints off fresh armor plates. Another column of American tanks advancing, engines growling in steady rhythm. He remembers the first time he saw them. Those unfamiliar silhouettes cresting the horizon. The clang of shots that bounced when they should have pierced. The disbelief that an enemy so new could arrive in numbers so great. The clash between German engineering brilliance and American industrial force had played out here and in. Countless fields beyond, firepower against availability, armor excellence against logistical momentum. The German tanker had once believed that the perfect machine would decide the battle. Yet the war taught a harsher lesson. The tank that could keep fighting tomorrow mattered more than the one that dominated today. Behind each Sherman was a factory, a ship, a rail line, a mechanic, an army behind the army, shaping victory as surely as any gunner. As the sun climbs, the ridge settles into silence, save for the distant rumble of engines sweeping toward the front once more. The war of tanks was not simply a duel of calibers and steel. It was a test of endurance, of nations, of will. Now the machines rest, their tracks cooling in the morning air. But the legacy of their struggle endures, in the recognition that war is won not only by the sharpest spear, but by the strength to forge it again and again.